The Montana sky wept that evening, dark clouds releasing their burden onto the parched earth below. Through sheets of relentless rain, the silhouette of a woman emerged on the horizon, clutching a bundle to her chest with one hand and a charred piece of paper in the other. Her destination was unclear, her purpose unknown, but the determination in her stride spoke of desperation. 73 miles. That's how far Eleanor Hayes had walked with her 3-month-old daughter, and nothing but a burnt map to guide her way. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Double Creek Ranch materialized like a mirage through the downpour, its weathered signs swinging violently in the wind. Eleanor paused, her soaked clothes clinging to her trembling frame, her boots caked with mud from her journey. The baby's cries, which had been constant for the past hour, were now drowned by the howling storm. "Just a little further, Rose," she whispered, pressing her lips against her daughter's forehead. "We're almost there." The ranch house stood solid against nature's fury, a beacon of warmth in the cold emptiness that had become Eleanor's world. Yellow light spilled from its windows, promising shelter, if only temporary. She had no claim to this place, no reason to expect kindness from its inhabitants. But the map, what remained of it after the fire, had led her here, and she had nowhere else to go. With the last of her strength, Eleanor trudged up the muddy path to the porch. Each step felt like moving through quicksand, her exhaustion nearly overwhelming. The baby's cries intensified, as if sensing their journey's end was near. Eleanor raised her hand to knock, then hesitated. What would she say? How could she explain her presence? The truth was too painful, too complicated. Before she could decide, the door swung open, revealing a tall man with shoulders broad as the Montana sky and eyes the color of thunderclouds. He wore faded jeans and a flannel shirt rolled up at the sleeves, revealing forearms corded with muscle from years of hard work. His expression shifted from surprise to concern as he took in the sight before him. "Ma'am," he said, his voice deep and steady, "you'd better come in out of this weather." Eleanor swayed on her feet, exhaustion and relief crashing over her in equal measure. She began, but the words dissolved on her tongue as darkness crept in from the edges of her vision. The last thing she remembered was the man lunging forward as her knees buckled, his strong arms catching her and the baby before they hit the ground. When Eleanor opened her eyes, she found herself lying on a worn leather couch, covered with a handmade quilt. For a moment, panic seized her as she realized her arms were empty. "Rose!" she gasped, struggling to sit up. "Your little one's just fine," came a gentle female voice from across the room. "My brother's got her." Eleanor's gaze darted to the source of the voice, a woman in her 30s with kind eyes and hair pulled back in a practical braid. Then to the man from the doorway, now seated in a rocking chair by the fireplace, cradling Rose with surprising tenderness for hands so large and weathered. The baby was quiet, apparently soothed by the steady motion and the crackle of the fire. "She was hungry," the man explained, his eyes never leaving the infant's face. Sarah warmed some milk, hoped that was all right. Eleanor nodded, relief washing through her. "Thank you, both of you." "I'm Matthew Colton," the man said. "This is my sister Sarah. You're at Double Creek Ranch." "Eleanor Hayes," she replied automatically, then immediately regretted giving her real name. Old habits died hard. The need for secrecy had been drilled into her for months. "And that's Rose." Sarah approached with a steaming mug. "Drink this. You look half frozen." The coffee was strong and sweet, exactly what Eleanor needed. As warmth spread through her body, she took stock of her surroundings. The ranch house was modest but well kept, with sturdy furniture and simple decorations. A working home, not a showplace. Through the window she could see the rain had slowed to a gentle patter, and beyond that, dark shapes that must be barns and corrals. The map, Eleanor suddenly remembered, patting her pockets frantically. "Where's the map?" Matthew reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew the charred paper, now carefully flattened. "It was pretty wet, but I laid it out to dry. Not much left of it, I'm afraid." Eleanor took it with trembling fingers, The fire had consumed most of it, leaving only a corner with the crude drawing of a ranch and the words Double Creek still visible. The rest, including the name of the person she was seeking, had been reduced to ash. "Does this place mean something to you?" Matthew asked, his voice careful, neutral. Eleanor hesitated. These people had shown her kindness, but trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. Not anymore. "I was told I might find work here," she said, the lie coming easily after months of practice. "My husband died last winter, mining accident. I've been making my way west ever since." Sarah's expression softened with sympathy. "I'm so sorry for your loss." Matthew's eyes, however, held something else. Not disbelief exactly, but a quiet assessment that made Eleanor uncomfortable. He'd spent his life reading weather patterns and the behavior of animals. Perhaps reading people came just as naturally. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "We don't have much in the way of hired help," he said finally. "Just me, Sarah, and old Joe who helps with the horses when his rheumatism allows. It's not a big operation." Eleanor's heart sank. Without work, without a reason to stay, she would have to move on. But to where? The map had been her only guide, her only plan. "But," Matthew continued, shifting Rose to his other arm, "we could use an extra pair of hands around here. Especially with calving season coming up. If you're willing to learn and work hard, we can offer room and board for you and your little one." Hope flickered in Eleanor's chest, tentative but warm. "I'm a quick learner," she said, "and I'm not afraid of hard work." Sarah smiled. "That's settled then. You'll stay in the guest room." "Well, it's hardly been used as such, mostly storage these days, but we'll clear it out tomorrow." "Tonight, you need rest." As if on cue, Rose began to fuss in Matthew's arms. He stood and brought the baby to Eleanor, their fingers brushing during the transfer. A strange current passed between them, making Eleanor pull back quickly. "Thank you," she said again, unable to meet his eyes. "For everything." Later, settled in Sarah's room for the night, the guest room would indeed need clearing, Eleanor nursed Rose while staring out at the now clear sky. Stars scattered across the darkness like diamonds on black velvet. More than she'd ever seen in the city. Rose's tiny hand curled around her finger, an anchor to this moment, this temporary peace. Eleanor knew it wouldn't last. Peace never did, not in her experience. Sooner or later, the past caught up. Sooner or later, she would have to run again. But for tonight, at least, they were safe. Morning arrived with golden light, streaming through uncurtained windows, and the smell of coffee and bacon permeating the air. For a moment, disoriented by actual rest, Eleanor forgot where she was. Then Rose stirred beside her, and reality came rushing back. Eleanor dressed quickly in her now dry clothes, grimacing at their worn state. She'd left Philadelphia with a trunk full of beautiful things. Dresses of fine cotton and silk, leather boots that had never seen mud. All abandoned in her flight, replaced by practical garments acquired at general stores along her journey west. The simple cotton dress she wore now had seen better days, but it was clean at least, thanks to Sarah's insistence on washing it the night before. Rose, wrapped in a soft blanket Sarah had produced from somewhere, gurgled happily as Eleanor carried her downstairs. The scene in the kitchen stopped her in the doorway. Matthew stood at the stove, his back to her, flipping pancakes with practiced ease. Sarah sat at the table, peeling apples into a bowl. They were talking quietly, their conversation halting abruptly when they noticed her presence. "Good morning," Sarah said brightly. Too brightly. "Sleep well?" "Better than I have in months," Eleanor admitted, trying to ignore the suspicion that they'd been discussing her. "Can I help with anything?" "Just sit and eat," Matthew said, sliding a plate of pancakes onto the table. "You'll need your strength if you're going to work here." The mention of work steadied Eleanor. This wasn't charity. This was an exchange. Her labor for shelter. An arrangement she could accept without shame. Breakfast passed with casual conversation, Sarah asking gentle questions about Rose, her age, her temperament, while carefully avoiding any inquiry into Eleanor's past. Matthew said little, but Eleanor felt his eyes on her throughout the meal, studying, assessing. After breakfast, Sarah took Rose, insisting that Eleanor needed time to settle in properly. "Matthew will show you around the ranch," she said, already bouncing the baby expertly on her hip. "I'll look after this little one. Been too long since we've had a baby at Double Creek." Outside, the ranch spread before them, revealing itself in the clear light of day. Double Creek was named for the two waterways that bordered the property, creating natural boundaries on the east and west. Between them lay rolling pastures where cattle grazed, a series of corrals, two large barns, and several smaller outbuildings. Beyond the immediate grounds, pine-covered hills rose to meet distant mountains, their peaks still capped with snow despite the late spring warmth. "It's beautiful," Eleanor breathed, momentarily forgetting her caution. Matthew nodded, pride evident in his bearing. "Been in the Colton family for 3 generations. My grandfather settled here after the Civil War. My father expanded it. Now it's just Sarah and me trying to keep it going." "No, Mrs. Colton?" Eleanor asked before she could stop herself. A shadow crossed Matthew's features. "No. Never found the time, I suppose." They walked in silence for a while, Matthew pointing out various aspects of the ranch operation, Eleanor asking occasional questions to demonstrate her willingness to learn. The work would be hard: feeding livestock, helping with calving, mending fences, cooking, cleaning, but not beyond her capabilities, despite her city upbringing. "What did you do before?" Matthew trailed off, gesturing vaguely at the invisible past. Eleanor tensed, selecting her words carefully. "I helped my father with his business. Bookkeeping, mostly. So you can read and cipher." "Yes." Matthew seemed pleased by this information. "That'll come in handy. I'm not much for paperwork. And Sarah does what she can, but neither of us has the head for numbers that Pa did." They reached a small cabin set apart from the main house, its porch sagging slightly, windows dusty with disuse. "This was the foreman's cabin, back when we had enough hands to need one," Matthew explained, producing a key from his pocket. "We thought it might suit you and Rose better than a room in the main house. More privacy." The interior was basic but sound. A main room with a small stove, table, and chairs. A bedroom just large enough for a bed and dresser. A lean-to addition that could serve as a nursery for Rose. Everything was coated in dust, the air stale from being closed up too long. "Needs work," Matthew acknowledged, running a finger along a dusty windowsill. "But the roof doesn't leak, and the stove works. We can have it ready in a day or 2. Eleanor walked to the center of the room, turning slowly to take it all in. A place of their own. A temporary sanctuary. "It's perfect," she said, and meant it. Matthew cleared his throat. "About your wages." "Room and board is enough for now," Eleanor interrupted quickly, "for both of us. When I've proven my worth, we can discuss actual payment." Matthew studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Fair enough. But you'll let us know if you need anything. Sarah's already making lists of things for the baby." Something tightened in Eleanor's chest at the casual kindness. "Why are you doing this?" she asked suddenly. "Taking in strangers, offering work, preparing a cabin. You don't know anything about me." Matthew's gaze was steady, unflinching. "My grandfather had a saying. The measure of a ranch isn't in its acreage or head of cattle, but in whether its gate swings open to those in need. Double Creek has always had open gates, Ms. Hayes." It was the perfect answer. Honorable, generous, uncomplicated. And Eleanor didn't believe it for a second. There was something more behind the Coltons, ready acceptance, something Matthew wasn't saying. But pressing the issue might raise questions she couldn't answer. "Please, call me Eleanor," she said instead, offering a smile she hoped appeared genuine. "Eleanor," he repeated, her name sounding different in his deep voice. "Welcome to Double Creek." The next few days passed in a blur of activity. True to his word, Matthew had the cabin habitable within 48 hours, enlisting the help of old Joe Blackburn, whose gnarled hands belied their dexterity with a hammer and saw. Sarah arrived with armloads of linens, curtains, and cooking utensils, transforming the Spartan space into something that resembled a home. For Rose, they produced a cradle that Matthew himself had slept in as an infant, sanded and repainted by Sarah in pale yellow. "Every baby should have something pretty," she'd said when Eleanor protested the effort. Throughout it all, Eleanor worked alongside them, determined to prove her value. She learned the rhythms of ranch life quickly, the pre-dawn wake-ups, the feeding schedules, the 1,000 small tasks that kept livestock alive and a household functioning. Her soft hands blistered, then calloused. Her skin tanned from hours in the sun. Her city posture gave way to the practical stance of someone who carried buckets and hay bales. And every night, bone-tired but oddly satisfied, she would put Rose to bed in the yellow cradle, then sit on her small porch and stare at the stars, thinking of all that had brought her here, and all that threatened to take it away. It was on one such evening, 2 weeks after her arrival, that Matthew found her. He approached from the direction of the barn, his footsteps deliberately heavy on the path to announce his presence. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. Eleanor nodded, suddenly conscious of her work clothes and wind-tangled hair. She'd never been vain, but something about Matthew Colton made her aware of herself in ways that were both uncomfortable and exhilarating. He sat, stretching his long legs before him, and for a while they simply existed in companionable silence, watching the fireflies begin their nightly dance over the pasture. "You're doing well with the work," he said finally. "Better than I expected, truth be told." "Disappointed?" she asked, a smile playing at her lips despite herself. "Impressed," he corrected. "Most city folk can't adapt the way you have." Eleanor stiffened slightly. "What makes you think I'm from the city?" Matthew chuckled, the sound low and warm in the gathering darkness. "Your hands, when you first came. Soft as new calfskin. The way you looked at a pitchfork like it might bite. How you called a halter a bridle. Little things." Heat rose to Eleanor's cheeks, embarrassment mingling with alarm. If he'd noticed these details, what else had he observed? "I don't mean any offense," Matthew added quickly. "Like I said, I'm impressed. You learn fast and work hard. That's what matters here." Eleanor relaxed slightly, though wariness lingered. "Thank you for saying so." "Sarah thinks you're running from something," Matthew said, his tone conversational, as if discussing the weather. "Or someone." The night air suddenly felt too thin, insufficient for breathing. "And what do you think?" Eleanor managed, her voice admirably steady. Matthew turned to look at her directly, his face half illuminated by the light spilling from her cabin window. "I think everyone's entitled to their secrets, so long as those secrets don't bring harm to others." "And if they might?" The question escaped before Eleanor could reconsider, hanging between them like smoke. Matthew was quiet for so long that Eleanor thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was soft but firm. "Then it would depend on the nature of the harm, I suppose, and who might suffer it." He stood then, nodding toward the cabin. "It's getting late. I should let you rest." At the edge of the porch he paused. "Whatever brought you to Double Creek, Eleanor, you're here now. That's what matters." As he walked away, his figure gradually blending with the darkness, Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the mild evening. Matthew's words should have reassured her, yet beneath his acceptance lurked a question he hadn't asked directly. What would happen when her past inevitably caught up with her? Because it would. Eleanor had no illusions about that. The only uncertainty was how much damage would be done when it did, and who would be caught in the crossfire. Inside the cabin, Rose slept peacefully, one tiny fist pressed against her cheek. Eleanor stood over the cradle, watching her daughter's chest rise and fall with each breath, marveling at how something so small could carry so much weight. Every decision, every risk, every lie, all for this child who would never remember the journey that brought them here. "I'll keep you safe," Eleanor whispered, a promise she'd made 1,000 times since Rose's birth. "Whatever it takes." But as she prepared for bed, Matthew's presence lingered like a shadow in her thoughts. His quiet strength, his measured words, The way he looked at her as if trying to read something written between her carefully constructed lines. It had been a long time since Eleanor had allowed herself to notice such things about a man, longer still since she'd felt the dangerous pull of attraction. She couldn't afford such feelings now. Attachment meant vulnerability, and vulnerability was a luxury reserved for those whose lives weren't built on shifting sand. For Eleanor and Rose, Double Creek was a temporary haven, nothing more. Pretending otherwise would only make their inevitable departure more painful. Yet as sleep finally claimed her, Eleanor's dreams were filled with open gates and a deep voice saying her name as if it were something precious. The weeks stretched into a month, and Eleanor found herself settling into life at Double Creek with alarming ease. The work, though demanding, gave structure to days that had been chaotic for too long. Rose thrived in the clean mountain air, growing plumper and more alert with each passing day. Even Eleanor's constant vigilance began to relax, just slightly, as no sign of pursuit materialized. Sarah became a friend, teaching Eleanor the domestic arts she'd never fully mastered as a society daughter: how to make bread that actually rose, how to preserve the summer's bounty for winter, how to mend clothes so the repairs nearly disappeared. In return, Eleanor offered what she could: assistance with the ranch accounts, stories from her travels, companionship to a woman who'd spent too many years surrounded only by men. And Matthew remained a puzzle Eleanor couldn't quite solve. He worked from sunrise to sunset, his dedication to the ranch absolute. Yet he always found time to stop by her cabin, usually with some small pretext: a repair that needed attention, a question about the accounts, a toy he'd carved for Rose. Their conversations were easy, natural, often stretching long past the original purpose of his visit. It was during one such evening, as summer began its slow transition to fall, that Eleanor finally asked the question that had been troubling her. "Why didn't you marry?" she said as they sat on her porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and crimson. "You mentioned time before, but surely that's not the only reason." Matthew seemed unsurprised by the personal query, as if he'd been expecting it. "Partly time," he acknowledged. "Ranching doesn't leave much room for courting. But mostly—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I watched my father with my mother. The way he looked at her, even after 30 years together, like she was sunrise after the longest night. I decided early on I wouldn't settle for less than that." The simple honesty of his answer caught Eleanor off guard. "And you never found it?" A half-smile curved his mouth. "Came close once. Or thought I did. Caroline Harrison, the schoolteacher over in Pine Ridge. Pretty, smart, kind to everyone. We courted for nearly a year. What happened? Winter of '88 hit. Worst blizzard in memory. I spent 3 weeks fighting to save the herd, barely slept, nearly froze to death twice. When the snow finally let up enough to make it to town, I found out she'd accepted a proposal from the banker's son while I was gone." His tone held no bitterness, just a matter-of-fact acceptance. "Turned out she wanted security more than she wanted me. Can't fault her for that. Banking's a sight more stable than ranching." Eleanor tried to imagine this woman who had rejected Matthew Colton for someone safer, more predictable. It seemed incomprehensible, though perhaps that was her own dangerous attachment speaking. "Sorry," she offered. Matthew shrugged. "Don't be. She got what she needed. And I learned something important about myself. Which was that I'm Double Creek, for better or worse. Couldn't be happy anywhere else, with anyone who didn't understand that." He turned to look at her, his gaze direct. "What about you? There was a husband, you said." The question wasn't unexpected, but it still made Eleanor's heart race. Another lie to maintain, another truth to hide. "Yes," she said, forcing herself to meet his eyes. "Thomas. He was kind. It was a good marriage, while it lasted. You must miss him." "Every day," Eleanor replied, the words hollow in her mouth. Matthew nodded, accepting her answer without pressing further. But something in his expression, a flicker of doubt, perhaps, told Eleanor he wasn't entirely convinced. The realization should have frightened her, but instead, It sent a different kind of shiver down her spine. How long before he saw through all her carefully constructed stories? And what would happen when he did? The first hint of autumn painted the aspen trees gold against the evergreen backdrop of pine and spruce. Eleanor stood at the edge of the eastern creek, laundry basket balanced on her hip, watching Rose crawl on a blanket spread nearby. 3 months at Double Creek had changed them both. Rose was sitting up now, reaching for the world with curious hands, while Eleanor had grown stronger, her confidence returning with each day that passed without incident. "You're getting too fast," she told her daughter, who had abandoned the blanket to explore the pebbled creek bank. Rose responded with a delighted gurgle, tiny fingers grasping at a wildflower. The sound of hoofbeats made Eleanor tense, her hard-won peace instantly disrupted. She relaxed only when she recognized Matthew's stallion cresting the small rise that separated the creek from the main ranch. He rode with the easy grace of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle, one with his mount in a way that still fascinated Eleanor despite her growing familiarity with ranch life. "Afternoon," he called, dismounting in a fluid motion and securing his horse to a nearby tree. "Thought I might find you two down here." Eleanor returned to her washing, plunging a sheet into the cool water. "Rose likes the sound of the creek. It helps her nap." Matthew knelt beside the baby, who immediately reached for the battered hat he wore. He surrendered it with a chuckle, letting Rose examine the sweat-stained leather. "Smart girl!" Nothing more soothing than running water. For a while, they existed in companionable silence. Eleanor washing, Matthew entertaining Rose, the creek providing a gentle soundtrack to their domestic tableau. It was moments like these, Eleanor realized, that had become precious to her. Simple, unguarded intervals of connection that felt dangerously like belonging. "Letter came for you," Matthew said finally, reaching into his shirt pocket. Eleanor's hands froze mid-motion, water dripping from her suddenly numb fingers. "For me?" Addressed to Eleanor Hayes, Double Creek Ranch, came with the supply wagon from town. He held out the envelope, his expression carefully neutral. "Thought you might want it right away." She took it with trembling hands, her mind racing. No one knew she was here. No one was supposed to know. She'd been careful, so careful, never using her real name in towns they passed through, paying in cash when necessary, keeping to back roads and avoiding railroads. The envelope was plain, the handwriting unfamiliar. No return address. Eleanor turned it over, then back again, as if the sender's identity might materialize from further inspection. "Aren't you going to open it?" Matthew asked, his tone light but his eyes watchful. Eleanor swallowed hard. "Later, when my hands are dry." She tucked the letter into her pocket, forcing her features into what she hoped was a casual expression. "Was there anything else from town? Did the seed catalog Sarah wanted arrive?" Matthew allowed the change of subject, though his gaze lingered on her pocket. "They did. And a package from her friend in Denver. More yarn than any sane person needs, if you ask me." The conversation returned to safer topics. The approaching winter, preparations for the livestock, repairs needed on the outbuildings. But the letter burned against Eleanor's side like a hot coal, its presence impossible to ignore. Later, alone in her cabin with Rose finally asleep, Eleanor opened it with shaking fingers. "I know where you are." Read the single line of text. No signature, no explanation needed. Eleanor sank onto a chair, the paper slipping from her grasp to flutter to the floor. Fear, her constant companion for so long, returned with crushing force, squeezing her lungs until each breath became a conscious effort. How had he found her? What mistake had she made? And most importantly, how much time did she have? A soft knock at the door nearly stopped her heart. She snatched up the note, crumpling it in her fist, before crossing to the door. "Who is it?" she called, hating the tremor in her voice. "Matthew! Sorry to disturb you so late." Eleanor hesitated, then opened the door just enough to see him standing on her porch, his expression concerned. "Is everything all right?" he asked immediately. "Fine," she lied. "Just tired. It was a long day." He studied her face, clearly not believing her. The letter. Bad news? For a wild moment, Eleanor considered telling him everything. The truth about why she'd come to Double Creek, the danger following her, the terrible choice she'd soon have to make. But the words stuck in her throat. Once spoken, there would be no taking them back, and Matthew's opinion of her would change forever. Nothing important, she said instead. An old acquaintance found out where I am. That's all. Matthew was quiet for a long moment, the silence between them heavy with all she wasn't saying. Finally, he nodded. Well, if you need anything at all, you know where to find me. Thank you, Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. Good night, Matthew. She closed the door before he could respond, then leaned against it, listening to his footsteps recede into the night. Tears stung her eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. Crying solved nothing, changed nothing. She needed to think, to plan. They would have to leave, of course. There was no other option. Pack what little they had and disappear before he arrived. But to where? Winter approached, and traveling with an infant in the cold months would be dangerous. They had no money for train tickets, no destination that promised safety. And beneath these practical concerns lay a deeper pain. The thought of leaving Double Creek, of never again seeing Matthew's smile or feeling Sarah's motherly embrace. In just 3 months, this place had become more of a home than any she'd known before. These people, more of a family. Eleanor crossed to the fireplace and tossed the crumpled note into the flames, watching as the paper blackened and curled, taking its threat with it. Not its power, though. That remained, heavy as a stone in her chest. She had until morning, she decided, one night to savor what she would soon lose, to gather her courage for the road ahead. At dawn, she and Rose would be gone, leaving nothing behind but memories and regrets. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. The pounding on her door came just before midnight, urgent and impossible to ignore. Eleanor bolted upright in bed, disoriented and immediately afraid. It was happening already. He had found her, come for her in the darkness when she was most vulnerable. Eleanor! Sarah's voice, high with panic, dispelled that particular fear. Eleanor, wake up! The barn's on fire! Eleanor threw open the door to see Sarah silhouetted against an orange glow coming from the direction of the main ranch buildings. The acrid smell of smoke filled the air, and now that she was fully awake, Eleanor could hear shouts and the frightened whinnies of horses. Rose, Sarah said breathlessly. I'll stay with her. Matthew needs help getting the animals out. Eleanor hesitated only a moment before nodding. She's asleep. Should stay that way for a few hours yet. She grabbed her shawl and boots, heart pounding as she ran toward the fire. The scene at the barn was chaos. Flames licked up the wooden walls, casting hellish light over the ranch yard. Matthew and old Joe were struggling to lead panicked horses from the burning structure, while a handful of neighboring ranchers who must have seen the glow and ridden to help were forming a bucket brigade from the well. Without waiting for instruction, Eleanor plunged into the smoky interior of the barn. The heat was oppressive, the smoke stinging her eyes and scratching her throat. She found Matthew in one of the stalls, trying to calm a terrified mare. "Get out of here!" he shouted when he saw her. "It's not safe!" "I'm not leaving you," she shouted back, moving to the horse's other side. Together they managed to guide the animal toward the door where Joe took the reins. "The tack room," Matthew gasped, coughing as smoke filled his lungs. "Pa's saddle." "Forget it," Eleanor insisted, grabbing his arm. "Nothing in there is worth your life." A thunderous crack from above made them both look up in alarm. Part of the roof was giving way, flaming debris raining down around them. Matthew pushed Eleanor toward the door, shielding her with his body as they stumbled into the relative safety of the yard. They emerged to find the bucket brigade losing its battle against the flames. The barn was too far gone, the fire too fierce. All they could do now was ensure it didn't spread to the other buildings. For hours they fought the blaze, working alongside neighbors until their arms ached and their lungs burned. By dawn, the barn was nothing but smoldering ruins, but the rest of the ranch had been saved. As the neighbors departed with promises to return and help rebuild, Eleanor found herself standing beside Matthew at the edge of the destruction. His face was streaked with soot, his expression grim as he surveyed the damage. "Could have been worse," he said finally. "No animals lost, no people hurt. The rest is just wood and nails." Eleanor nodded, too exhausted for words. The night's events had pushed thoughts of fly Coet from her mind. But now, with morning light spreading across the ranch, reality returned. She needed to leave, today, before it was too late. But Matthew wasn't finished. "It wasn't an accident," he said, his voice low, meant only for her. "The fire started outside the barn, not in the hay storage where it would if it were natural." Someone said it deliberately. Eleanor's blood ran cold. "How can you be sure?" "Found a whiskey bottle with a rag stuffed in it, broken at the south wall where the fire burned hottest." He turned to look at her directly, his eyes hard with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "Your letter. The old acquaintance who found you." "This have anything to do with that?" The question hung between them, impossible to evade. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, gathering what little courage remained after the night's ordeal. "Yes," she admitted finally. "I think it might." Matthew's jaw tightened, but he didn't look surprised. "I think it's time you told me the truth, Eleanor. All of it." He was right, of course. The luxury of secrets was gone, burned away with the barn. She owed him the truth, even if it meant losing everything. "Not here," she said, glancing toward the house where Sarah would be waiting with Rose. "And not until I've checked on my daughter." Rose was indeed fine, sleeping peacefully through the night's drama. Sarah, though exhausted, insisted on preparing breakfast for everyone, declaring that empty stomachs made for poor thinking. Eleanor washed the smoke and ash from her face and hands, changed into clean clothes, and steeled herself for the conversation to come. They gathered around the kitchen table, Matthew, Sarah, and Eleanor, mugs of strong coffee before them. Eleanor cradled Rose in her arms, drawing strength from her daughter's warm weight. "My name is Eleanor Hayes," she began, deciding that truth, once started, should be complete. "That much is real. I was born and raised in Philadelphia, the only daughter of James Hayes, who owned Hayes Shipping Company." Sarah's eyes widened slightly at the name. Even in rural Montana, Hayes Shipping was known, its influence stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. "I was raised in privilege," Eleanor continued. "The best schools, the finest clothes, a debut into society that my father spent a small fortune on. I was expected to make an advantageous marriage to a man who would eventually take over the company since I was," she smiled wryly, "inconveniently female for inheritance purposes." "And did you," Sarah asked gently, "make such a marriage?" Eleanor's smile faded. "I thought I had. Richard Thornton was everything my father wanted in a son-in-law, Harvard-educated, from an old family with good connections, ambitious. The fact that he was handsome and charming made it easier to accept the arrangement." She paused, the memories still painful despite the passage of time. "We were married 4 years ago, and Richard joined my father in the business. Everything seemed perfect." "But it wasn't," Matthew said, his voice soft but certain. Eleanor shook her head. "No, it wasn't. Richard had expensive tastes and a gambling problem he'd hidden well during our courtship. He began embezzling from the company to cover his debts. Small amounts at first, then larger as his losses grew. My father discovered the discrepancies last year, but by then Richard had taken nearly $50,000. Sarah gasped, the sum almost incomprehensible in their rural economy. Father confronted him privately, offered to cover the losses if Richard would agree to treatment for his gambling. A quiet resolution to avoid scandal. Eleanor's voice grew tight. "Richard agreed, or pretended to. 2 weeks later, my father died in what appeared to be a robbery gone wrong at his office." "Appeared to be?" Matthew's gaze sharpened. "There was an investigation, of course. Everything pointed to unknown thieves. But I knew." Eleanor's arms tightened around Rose, who stirred but didn't wake. "I knew Richard was responsible. He'd been desperate, cornered. With my father gone, his position in the company was secure. I was the only heir, and as my husband, he controlled everything." "Did you confront him?" Sarah asked. "Not directly. I was afraid, and pregnant by then. I started gathering evidence quietly, documenting the missing funds, looking for witnesses who might have seen Richard near my father's office that night." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly against the surge of emotion. "I thought I was being careful, but he realized what I was doing. One night, I overheard him talking with someone about arranging another accident, this one for me after the baby was born." The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Even Rose seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, sleeping quietly in her mother's arms. "I ran that night," Eleanor continued. Took what cash I could find in the house and fled. I was 7 months pregnant, terrified, with nowhere to go. I couldn't risk going to the police. Richard had connections there, and my evidence wasn't concrete enough to guarantee his arrest before he found me. So you kept running, Matthew said. It wasn't a question. Eleanor nodded. Rose was born in a small town in Ohio. The midwife there helped me, asked no questions. As soon as we could travel, we moved on. West seemed safest, away from Richard's influence. I had a map marked with places I might find work, people who might help without asking too many questions. Double Creek? Sarah murmured. Yes, the last stop on my map, given to me by a woman in Denver who'd once worked for a family named Colton. She said they were good people. Eleanor attempted a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The map was damaged in a fire at our last lodging, a boarding house where I'd been working as a maid. I thought perhaps it was an accident, but now you think Richard has found you, Matthew finished, his expression grim. And last night's fire was a warning. Or an attempt that failed, Eleanor whispered. Either way, I've put you all in danger by coming here. I should have left weeks ago. Nonsense, Sarah said firmly, reaching across the table to grasp Eleanor's hand. You're not alone in this anymore. Sarah's right, Matthew agreed, standing abruptly. You're not going anywhere. Not without protection. Eleanor looked up at him, startled by the fierce determination in his voice. Matthew, you don't understand. Richard is dangerous. He killed my father, would have killed me. I can't let him harm anyone else because of me. And I can't let you face this alone, Matthew countered. This is Colton land. We protect what's ours. The possessive claim sent a shiver through Eleanor that had nothing to do with fear. I'm not yours to protect, she said softly. Something flashed in Matthew's eyes, a heat that had been banked until now, carefully controlled. Aren't you? He asked, his voice equally soft. Before Eleanor could respond, Sarah cleared her throat pointedly. Perhaps we should focus on practical matters, she suggested, though her eyes sparkled with poorly concealed interest in this exchange. If this Richard person is indeed here, what do we do? Matthew seemed to gather himself, turning from Eleanor with visible effort. First, we send word to Sheriff Bridges in town. He should know there's a potential threat. The sheriff can't help, Eleanor protested. Even if he believed my story without evidence, his jurisdiction doesn't cover the ranch. We're too far out. Tom Bridges is a friend, Matthew said. He'll come. In the meantime, I'll talk to the neighbors. After last night's fire, they'll be willing to keep watch. He looked at Eleanor again, his expression softening. No one's going to hurt you or Rose. Not here. Not while I'm alive. The conviction in his voice nearly undid her. For so long, Eleanor had carried the weight of their safety alone, making decisions based solely on survival. The offer of partnership, of shared burden, was almost too much to comprehend. Why? She asked, the question escaping before she could reconsider. Why would you risk so much for someone you barely know? Matthew held her gaze steadily. I think you know why, Eleanor. And she did. The knowledge had been growing between them for months, unacknowledged but undeniable. In another life, with different circumstances, it might have blossomed into something beautiful. But here, now, with danger closing in, it felt like just one more thing she stood to lose. I can't stay, she said, though the words cost her dearly. Not if it means putting you and Sarah in harm's way. That's not your decision to make, Matthew replied, his tone gentle but firm. We're choosing this. Choosing you. Rose stirred in Eleanor's arms, blinking awake with perfect timing. Her small face scrunched momentarily, then relaxed into a smile of recognition as she focused on her mother. Eleanor felt her resolve wavering. For Rose's sake, wouldn't it be better to accept help, to fight rather than flee? One day, she said finally. I'll give it one day. If Richard hasn't shown himself by then, perhaps. Perhaps you're right. Matthew nodded, accepting this compromise. One day. But Eleanor? He waited until she met his eyes, again. When he does come, and he will, remember what I said. This is where we make our stand. Together. The word hung in the air between them, full of promise and peril in equal measure. Together. After so many months of isolation and fear, the concept was as terrifying as it was tempting. Sarah stood, breaking the moment. "I'll make more coffee," she announced. "Something tells me we're going to need it." As she bustled about the kitchen, Matthew moved to the window, staring out at the ranch yard, where the charred remains of the barn still smoldered. His profile was strong, determined, every inch the protector he'd declared himself to be. Eleanor looked down at Rose, now fully awake and reaching for a strand of her mother's hair. "What do you think, little one?" she whispered. "Do we trust him? Do we stay and fight?" Rose gurgled in response, her tiny fingers closing around Eleanor's thumb with surprising strength. The gesture felt like an answer of sorts, a small vote for courage over caution. One day Eleanor had promised 24 hours to decide their fate, to choose between running alone or standing with these people who, against all odds, had become her family. The promised day stretched before Eleanor like a tightrope, precarious, uncertain, with danger waiting at either end. She moved through her morning tasks with heightened awareness, every sound from the ranch yard drawing her attention, every shadow causing her heart to stutter. Rose seemed to sense her mother's anxiety, fussing more than usual as Eleanor changed and fed her. "It's all right, sweetheart," Eleanor murmured, stroking the baby's soft cheek. "Everything's going to be fine." The words felt hollow, a promise she had no right to make. By mid-morning, the ranch had transformed into a subtle fortress. Neighbors arrived in twos and threes, ostensibly to help clear the burned barn and prepare for rebuilding. But Eleanor noticed how their eyes constantly scanned the horizon, how their rifle-laden saddles were never far from reach. Matthew moved among them, his voice low as he gave instructions, positioned men at strategic points around the property. Sarah refused to leave Eleanor's side, insisting they work together in the garden, harvesting the last of the late vegetables before the first frost. "No sense letting good food go to waste," she said matter-of-factly, as if the threat of violence wasn't hanging over them like a storm cloud. "You don't have to stay with me," Eleanor told her, hands deep in soil as she dug up potatoes. "I'm sure you have other tasks?" Sarah snorted, tossing another potato into the growing pile. "Stubborn, aren't you? Almost as bad as my brother." She straightened, pressing a hand to her lower back. "Eleanor Hayes, when are you going to accept that you're not alone anymore?" The simple question struck Eleanor with unexpected force. Alone. She'd been alone for so long, even before fleeing Philadelphia, even within her marriage. Isolation had become her natural state, self-reliance, her only constant companion. "It's not that simple," she began, but Sarah cut her off with a wave of her dirt-covered hand. "Actually, it is. Family isn't just blood, Eleanor. It's choice. And Matthew and I have chosen you and Rose." Sarah's expression softened. "The question is, will you choose us back?" Before Eleanor could formulate an answer, a shout from the direction of the eastern road drew their attention. One of the neighbors, positioned as a lookout, was galloping toward the house at full speed. "Rider coming," he called as he reined in his horse. "Well-dressed fella on a bay gelding. Doesn't look like he's from around here." Eleanor's blood turned to ice. "Richard," she whispered. Matthew materialized beside them, his expression grim. "Sarah, take Eleanor and Rose to the house. Stay there until I come for you." "Matthew," Eleanor began, but he silenced her with a gentle touch to her arm. "Trust me," he said, his eyes holding hers. "Please." After a moment's hesitation, Eleanor nodded. Sarah gathered the basket of vegetables, and the two women hurried toward the main house, Eleanor clutching Rose tightly to her chest. From the parlor window, Eleanor watched as Matthew and three of the neighbors positioned themselves in the yard, a casual-seeming welcome party with deadly intent lurking just beneath the surface. Minutes later, the rider appeared around the bend in the road. Even at a distance, Eleanor recognized him immediately. Richard Thornton sat a horse like a man who viewed the animal as beneath him, a mere conveyance rather than a partner. His clothes were impeccable despite the dust of travel, a tailored suit that would have looked more appropriate on a Boston street than a Montana ranch. As he drew closer, she could see his face had thinned since she'd last seen him, but his expression remained the same, cold, calculating with the practiced smile that had once charmed Philadelphia society. "Steady," Sarah murmured beside her, one hand resting on Eleanor's shoulder. "Remember, you're not facing him alone." Richard reined in his horse before Matthew, removing his hat with a flourish that struck Eleanor as obscenely theatrical. She couldn't hear their exchange, but she could imagine it. Richard's cultured voice, the smooth lies, the veiled threats. Matthew's posture remained relaxed, but Eleanor recognized the tension in his shoulders, the way his right hand never strayed far from the holstered pistol at his hip. After what seemed an eternity, Matthew gestured toward the house. Eleanor stepped back from the window, panic surging through her. They were coming inside. She would have to face Richard directly. "I can't," she whispered, clutching Rose closer. "Sarah, I can't do this." Sarah's face hardened with determination. "Yes, you can. You're stronger than you know, Eleanor Hayes, and he can't hurt you here." She took Rose gently from Eleanor's arms. "I'll take the little one upstairs. Some conversations aren't meant for innocent ears." Before Eleanor could protest, the front door opened. Matthew entered first, his eyes finding hers immediately, a silent message of support in their depths. Behind him came Richard, ducking slightly to clear the doorframe, his gaze sweeping the modest room with poorly concealed disdain before landing on Eleanor. "My dear wife," he said, his voice exactly as she remembered, smooth as silk over steel. "What a charming establishment you found yourself in." Eleanor straightened her spine, drawing strength from Matthew's solid presence nearby. "Hello, Richard. You've led me on quite a chase," he continued, setting his hat on a side table as if he'd been invited to make himself comfortable. "Really, Eleanor, running away like a common thief. It's beneath you." "Is it?" she asked, surprised at the steadiness of her voice. "I thought it was survival instinct, given your plans for me after Rose was born." Richard's smile didn't falter, but his eyes hardened. "I see you've been sharing your delusions with your hosts." He glanced at Matthew. "Mr. Colton, isn't it? I apologize for my wife's behavior. She's been unwell since the baby's birth. Prone to paranoia, the doctors said." "Interesting," Matthew replied, his tone deceptively casual. "She seems perfectly sound to me. Clear-headed enough to recognize a threat when she hears one." Richard's smile tightened fractionally. "I assure you, there's been a misunderstanding. I've only come to bring my wife and child home, where they belong." "And where would that be?" Eleanor asked. "Back to Philadelphia, where you can arrange another accident, like the one that killed my father?" For the first time, Richard's composure slipped, just slightly. "Your father died in a robbery, Eleanor. Everyone knows that. Your grief has twisted your memories." "My grief has clarified them," she countered. "I know what you did, Richard. I know about the embezzlement, about Father's discovery of it, about your conversation with that man in your study the night before I left." Richard's face hardened, the pretense of concern dropping away. "You always were too clever for your own good," he said, his voice colder now. "It's what attracted me to you in the first place. That, and your father's company, of course." He stepped closer, causing Matthew to tense visibly. "But you're still naive if you think accusations without proof will help you. Your word against mine, my dear. And who do you think society will believe? The unstable widow or the grieving son-in-law who's been searching tirelessly for his missing family?" Eleanor felt a chill at his words. Widow. As if her death was already accomplished in his mind. "Society isn't here," Matthew interjected, moving to stand beside Eleanor. "Just us. And out here, a man's word is judged by the character behind it." Richard's gaze flicked to Matthew, assessing and dismissive in the same moment. How charmingly rustic, but ultimately irrelevant. "Eleanor is my wife. The child is mine. The law is quite clear on my rights to both." "Rose isn't yours," Eleanor said quietly. A moment of shocked silence followed her declaration. "What did you say?" Richard's voice had dropped to a dangerous whisper. Eleanor lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. Rose isn't your daughter. She's James, Colton's child. Matthew's head whipped toward her, surprise written plainly across his features before he could master it. Richard caught the reaction and smiled thinly. A convenient lie, he said, and poorly executed considering Mr. Colton's obvious surprise. Try again, Eleanor. James Colton was my father's name, Matthew said, recovering quickly. My father. He passed last winter. Understanding dawned in Richard's eyes, followed by calculation. I see. And you expect me to believe that my wife was involved with your father before our marriage? That the child is some posthumous miracle? Before our marriage? Yes, Eleanor said, the lie coming more easily now as she built upon the foundation Matthew had provided. We were in love, but my father forbade it. Arranged my marriage to you instead, for business reasons. She swallowed hard, emotion lending credibility to her words. We met one last time before I left for Philadelphia. Rose was the result. Richard studied her face, searching for the deceit. Finding none, for the emotion behind her words was genuine, if misdirected. His expression darkened. Even if I believed this. Fairy tale, he said. It changes nothing. You were my wife when the child was born. Under the law, Rose is mine. Actually, came a new voice from the doorway. That might not be entirely accurate. Eleanor turned to see Sheriff Tom Bridges standing in the entryway, his weathered face serious beneath his wide-brimmed hat. Behind him stood Sarah, who must have fetched him after taking Rose upstairs. Sheriff, Richard said, his voice betraying the first hint of unease. This is a private family matter. Is it? Bridges stepped into the room, thumbs hooked in his belt. Seems to me it's a bit more complicated than that. Got a telegram this morning from the Philadelphia police. They've reopened the investigation into James Hayes' murder. Seems some new evidence has come to light. He fixed Richard with a steady gaze. They're mighty interested in speaking with you, Mr. Thornton. Color drained from Richard's face. What evidence? He demanded. Can't rightly say, the sheriff replied. Not my jurisdiction. But they asked me to detain you if you showed up in these parts. He patted the holster at his hip, which I'm prepared to do should it prove necessary. Richard's composure cracked entirely, his features contorting with rage. This is absurd. You have no grounds to detain me. I've committed no crime here. Attempted arson is a crime, Matthew said quietly. Burning down my barn last night. I was nowhere near your precious barn. Richard spat. I only arrived in the area this morning. Then you had help, Eleanor said, the pieces falling into place. The letter, the fire, someone working for you, watching me, reporting back. Richard's silence was confirmation enough. You'll come with me to town, Mr. Thornton, Sheriff Bridges said, no longer asking. We'll sort this out there, while we wait for word from Philadelphia. For a moment, Eleanor thought Richard might resist. His hands clenched at his sides, his gaze darting around the room as if seeking escape. Then, abruptly, he seemed to regain control, his features smoothing into the familiar mask of civility. Of course, Sheriff, he said, reaching for his hat. I'm happy to clear up this unfortunate misunderstanding. His eyes found Eleanor's, cold with promised retribution. This isn't over, my dear. Not by a long measure. As the sheriff led Richard from the house, Eleanor felt her knees weaken. Matthew was beside her instantly, guiding her to a chair, his hand warm and steady on her arm. Are you all right? He asked, crouching before her. Eleanor nodded, though in truth she felt far from all right. The confrontation had drained her completely, leaving her hollow and shaking. Is he really going to be detained? Tom Bridges is a man of his word, Matthew assured her. If he says he has cause to hold Richard, then he does. But for how long? And what happens when he's released? The questions tumbled out, fear giving them urgency. He'll come back, Matthew, or send someone else. He won't stop until... Hush, Matthew interrupted gently, taking her hands in his. We'll face that when it comes. For now, you're safe. Rose is safe. Eleanor looked down at their joined hands. hers pale and trembling, his son darkened and strong. "I lied," she whispered. "About Rose. About your father." "I know." A small smile touched his lips. "Quick thinking, though. You'd make a good rancher yet." Despite everything, Eleanor found herself smiling back. "I'm sorry to have involved your father in my deceptions." "Pa would have appreciated the drama of it all," Matthew said with a soft chuckle. He always did have a flair for the theatrical. His expression grew serious once more. "The question is, what do you want to do now?" Eleanor hesitated, the crossroads before her clearer than it had ever been. She could run again, find another town, another identity, keep moving until Richard lost her trail or lost interest. Or she could stay, build something here at Double Creek, fight for the life she and Rose deserved. "I want," she began, but was interrupted by Sarah's appearance at the top of the stairs. "The baby's asking for her mama," Sarah called down. And by asking, I mean demanding quite insistently. Eleanor rose, her decision momentarily deferred. "I should go to her." Matthew released her hands reluctantly. "We'll talk later," he promised, "after things have settled." Upstairs, Eleanor found Rose awake and fussy in the cradle Sarah had set up in the guest room. The moment she saw her mother, the baby's cries subsided into hiccuping whimpers. "There now," Eleanor soothed, lifting Rose into her arms. "Everything's all right." "Mama's here." Sarah lingered in the doorway, her expression thoughtful. "He's gone then? Your husband?" "For now," Eleanor replied, unable to muster more optimism than that. Sarah nodded, accepting this reality without comment. After a moment, she said, "Matthew cares for you. More than cares, I'd say." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Sarah, You don't need to explain," Sarah interrupted gently. "I've seen how you look at him, too. Life's too short and too hard out here to deny the heart what it wants, Eleanor." "It's not that simple," Eleanor protested, though the words lacked conviction even to her own ears. "It never is," Sarah agreed. "But sometimes the complicated path is the one most worth taking." She stepped forward, placing a motherly kiss on Eleanor's forehead. "Rest now. Tomorrow will bring its own decisions." Left alone with Rose, Eleanor moved to the window. From this vantage point, she could see the entire ranch spread before her. The fields where cattle grazed, the corral where Matthew was now unsaddling his horse, the burnt skeleton of the barn that would soon be rebuilt. Beyond lay the creek that gave the ranch its name, and further still the mountains rising purple and majestic against the autumn sky. For months, she had seen Double Creek as a temporary haven, a pause in their endless flight. Now, looking out at the land that had sheltered them, Eleanor allowed herself to imagine something different. A future here, roots sinking deep into this soil, seasons passing in the rhythm of ranch life, rather than in the frantic pace of running. "Could we stay, Rose?" she whispered to her daughter. "Could this be home?" Rose cooed in response, her tiny hand reaching toward the window as if she too felt the pull of this place. The question of Richard remained, of course. Even detained, he posed a threat. Eleanor had no illusions about his determination or his resources, but for the first time since fleeing Philadelphia, she felt something beyond fear when she thought of him. Anger, yes, but also determination. A willingness to fight rather than flee. Perhaps it was Matthew's influence, or Sarah's. Perhaps it was simply that after months of running, Eleanor had found something worth standing her ground for. As sunset painted the mountains gold, Eleanor made her decision. Whatever came next, whether it brought danger or deliverance, she would face it here, at Double Creek, with these people who had become family in all the ways that mattered. She found Matthew on the porch after supper, staring out at the darkening land with a cup of coffee in hand. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, his face softening at the sight of her. "Rose asleep?" he asked. Eleanor nodded, settling into the chair beside his. Sarah has a magic touch. One lullaby and she was out like a light. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the evening insects providing a gentle chorus to their thoughts. Finally, Matthew spoke. I sent one of the neighbors to town with a telegram, he said. To a friend of my father's in Philadelphia, a lawyer. Asked him to look into your husband's business dealings, see if there's anything that might corroborate your suspicions about your father's death. Eleanor turned to him, surprised and touched by this initiative. You believe me then? Without proof? Matthew met her gaze steadily. I believed you from the first day, Eleanor. A woman doesn't run hundreds of miles with an infant unless she has a damned good reason. Tears pricked at Eleanor's eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. She blinked them back fiercely. Thank you, she whispered. Matthew nodded, then set his coffee cup aside. Now, about what you said earlier, about Rose's parentage. I'm sorry for involving your father in my lie, Eleanor said quickly. It was the first thing that came to mind, and I thought perhaps it might make Richard less interested in claiming her if he believed she wasn't his. It was quick thinking, Matthew acknowledged, but it creates a certain situation. He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. If word gets around that Rose is a Colton, people will expect certain things. Eleanor frowned, not following his meaning. What things? They'll expect her to be raised on Colton land, with the Colton name. Matthew turned to face her fully, his expression more serious than she had ever seen it. They'll expect you and I to marry, Eleanor, for the sake of appearances, if nothing else. The statement hung between them, fraught with implications. Eleanor's heart thundered in her chest, hope and fear tangling in equal measure. Is that what you want? She asked, her voice barely audible over the chorus of crickets. Matthew's eyes held hers, their blue depths sincere and unwavering. What I want, he said slowly, is for you and Rose to stay at Double Creek, not as hired help, not as guests, but as family. What I want is to rebuild that barn and maybe add on to the cabin, make it a proper home for the three of us. What I want, his voice roughened with emotion, is to wake up every morning knowing you're here, safe, where you belong. Eleanor's breath caught. Matthew, let me finish, he said gently. I know you've been hurt. I know trust comes hard for you now. I'm not asking for promises or declarations. I'm just asking for a chance. A chance to show you that not all men are like Richard. A chance to be a father to Rose, to give her the kind of life every child deserves. Tears spilled freely now, tracking warm paths down Eleanor's cheeks. And if Richard comes back, if he brings the law, or more men with fire, Matthew's jaw set with determination, then we face him together. The truth will come out eventually, Eleanor. Your father's murder, the embezzlement. Men like Richard can't hide their true nature forever. He reached for her hand, engulfing it in his larger one. In the meantime, Double Creek is yours for as long as you want it. With or without me. The choice laid before her was clear. Continue running, forever looking over her shoulder, or plant her feet firmly on this land beside this man who offered protection without possession, strength without subjugation. The day we arrived, Eleanor said, her voice steadier now, when I was half dead from exhaustion and fear, holding nothing but my daughter and that burnt map, you said something to me. Do you remember? Matthew nodded, the memory clear in his eyes. I said stay, if this is where it ends. I didn't understand then, Eleanor continued. I thought you meant the end of my journey. But that's not what you meant, was it? No, Matthew agreed softly. I meant the end of your running, the end of being alone. Eleanor looked out at the ranch, at the land that had welcomed her when she had nothing to offer but broken trust and desperate need. Then back at Matthew, whose patience and quiet strength had become as essential to her as breathing. I want to stay, she said finally. Not because I have nowhere else to go, but because this is where I choose to be. With you, with Sarah, with Double Creek. The smile that transformed Matthew's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, gradual, then all at once blindingly beautiful. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles with a reverence that made her heart stutter. Then stay, he said simply. Stay, and we'll face whatever comes together. As if to seal this promise, the evening star appeared above the mountains, a single point of light guiding travelers home. Eleanor felt something within her shift and settle, the wanderer finding harbor, the fugitive finding sanctuary. Double Creek had been the final destination on her burnt map, the last hope of a desperate mother. Now it would be the first chapter of a new story, one written not in fear and flight, but in courage and love. Together, Eleanor echoed, the word of vow as binding as any she had ever made. And in that moment, with the Montana night spreading its star-studded canopy above them, Eleanor Hayes, who had arrived with nothing but a crying baby and a burnt map, found that endings could sometimes be beginnings in disguise. That sometimes the journey's end was exactly where the heart had been traveling all along. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.